If we have hunger, then people, like you mentioned early in the opening, you're going to have people migrating to different places. It is also a security risk issue because people are going to go where food and water is. So all of a sudden that may affect you. If it doesn't hurt you now, they may be in your backyard later.
Thank you very much. At that point, we're going to bring in three colleagues, three experts here in the studio to continue the conversation. Gordon Conway, the former chief scientist for the British government's International Development Department, who's done an enormous amount of research into this issue. Next to him is Duncan Green from Oxfam, and also with me is Matt Ridley, an author who, it's fair to say, is a bit of a food crisis skeptic. So we want to hear from all of them, and Carl will be listening as well. Let me start, if I may, with you, Gordon. I mean, the picture you heard there from Carl, you reflect the same concerns, I guess. I mean,
yes, I do.
What is the most urgent?
Well, there are three things that are going on. One is these food price spikes. We're now in the middle of a second food price spike. Food prices have gone up enormously. That's an inconvenience in the West, but it's devastating for developing countries. So that's one. The second is that we've got this nearly billion people who are chronically hungry, more chronically hungry people in the world than we've ever had. And the third is that we've got to increase food production by 70%, 100% by 2050 if we're going to feed the world. Those are three big challenges for us.
Does it look the same way to you as well, Duncan?
Yes, Oxfam's seeing a lot of bad changes in these directions in our programmes around the world. We're seeing increasingly erratic climate making life very difficult for farmers. We're seeing the impact of these food price spikes, and we're actually devoting the next 4 years of our public campaigning to trying to deal with some of these issues and raise them with policymakers.
Now, Matt, you don't agree with the gloomy projections at this time. You think there's grounds for optimism more than gloom.
I do. I think that clearly we have enormous challenges, and Gordon's right, we've got to increase food production in order to keep up with the growing population. But if you look at what we've achieved over the last 50 years, we've trebled the yields of cereal agriculture without taking any extra land into production. We've largely prevented the enormous famines that were killing hundreds of millions, well, tens of millions of people in China and India in the 50s and 60s. And we've done so by applying fertilizer and new technologies to farming and also infrastructure. And yes, we're having price spikes at the moment, but from historically unprecedentedly low levels of food prices. Now, it'd be nice if we didn't have the price spikes, and one of the causes of that is because we've been taking food out of agriculture and putting it into motor fuel, and that has helped boost the price of food, which is a mistake in my view.
Now, was that too rosy a picture there, Gordon? A bit?
Yes, I think it is too rosy. I mean, I agree, we've got the technologies that can allow us to increase food production enormously. But we have to remember that if you look at, for example, at Africa, it's not just about having the technologies, it's about producing new seed, getting seed into the hands of farmers. It's also about the farmers being able to market their products, so getting them to market. All of that requires infrastructure. It's interesting, at the last food price spike in Africa, food production actually went down, even though in theory they could get more money. The reason why they aren't growing more food is all the barriers.
Could you just explain a food spike or any sort of spike, because it may not be lingo all around the world?
Well, basically, in 2006, the FAO said the price of food was like that. And it started rising in 2007 and went right up to a peak in 2008. I mean, it was about 50% or more before what it was. Then it came down again, and everybody said, oh, that's all right. But in 2009, it started to increase again, and in 2010, it shot right up. And we're now as high as we were in 2008. So the price is doing this all the time. And I'm not sure it's just going to stop. I think we're going to get more of that.
If I can jump in there,
yeah.
And we can see that even more in America. We're already talking about a food spike even more for 2011. So that's going to happen. And of course, we're using corn, like you mentioned earlier, for fuel. But where is our future for our environment? So we have to think of all these issues when it comes to food prices and also feeding people.
Do you see a growing awareness of this problem, or still very insufficient awareness of this problem in America?
Yeah, well, the reality is that the food spikes and prices are happening here. As you know, there's a big push for ethanol. So the corn prices have spiked, and that takes everything up in terms of food. I've just heard recently where people are saying the huge prices in milk and meat, it's going up, and they're predicting almost doubling in 2011. So even those who are not starving, it's affecting their home budgets. And at the same time, oil prices are going up here. So we feel that as well, even though we're in a developed country.
Thank you very much. Matt, the question of food prices going high and so on, from what you touched on just now, doesn't worry you as much as it worries some, because there's a past precedent that was worse than today, is it?
Yes, we've had food price spikes before, and what they tend to do is they tend to produce more plantings. I mean, people go out and increase their acreage. This is happening in Europe this winter. People are looking at the wheat price and saying, I'm going to plant more, etc. And that tends to bring the price down. And the price, even though it has spiked upwards, it is still 30% below in real terms where it was in 1980. And it's something like 90% below where it was in 1900. So food has become more affordable. Now, you know, it was extraordinarily low a few years ago, to the point where land was coming out of production for food. And the things we can do, for example, you know, in Europe we have trade barriers against food from Africa. You know, a lot of cereals encounter tariff barriers if they try and export to Europe. Just getting rid of simple things like that would improve the productivity of the world. But then there's high-tech solutions coming down the pike behind that. Some of the GM technologies for dealing with drought and other things are going to increase the productivity of crops quite markedly. It's not going to be without its challenges. It's going to be hard work, but so long as we innovate, I see no reason why we can't get to a point where we're feeding 9 billion people in 2050 at a better level and with far less hunger than we do today.
Yeah, I noticed there, Gordon, you wanted to come in there. I mean, but do you see it as much of a optimistic side looking back at the figures, or do you feel that rather than talking, as you did there, Matt, about challenges, that it's a more awesome word today and should be crises or something like that?
Well, I'm also an optimist because I've seen what's happened, but I think optimism is a genetic trait and I just happen to have got it.
Yeah.
But I think the problem is, as Matt says, you can feed the 9 billion, but it's not just feeding the 9 billion. They're increasing their consumption of livestock. You've got to produce much more grain because of the livestock they're eating. The prices of fertilizers are going up. There's shortages of water and shortages of land, and we've got climate change on top of that. So it's not just as simple as feeding an extra 2 billion people. There's an enormous number of other things that have got to be tackled, and that's partly due to the technologies that Matt's talking about, but it's also due to getting both the governments and the private sector to work much better together than they are now. That's where I get pessimistic, is about getting governments and private sector to really work on this.
To really work together. Do you get pessimistic about things like that?
I get pessimistic until I talk to poor people, and then usually you come away feeling much more excited about the possibilities.
Yeah.
But I think there's another problem here, which is these kind of purely technological solutions ignore the fact that there's enough food in the world today and 1 billion people are going hungry. The system is producing 1 billion hungry people and 1 billion overweight and obese people. The system is not actually working. So we do have to look at the system itself, not just at technological solutions, and say, how do we actually increase the voice, the power of people at the bottom to get their fair share, to organise so they get decent prices for their crops, to actually change the system so that people are getting a decent slice of the action, because at the moment it really isn't happening and technology won't solve that.
Obesity there you're mentioning, does that just have a sort of the obvious effect of people consuming more food, but is it more of a problem than that?
Oh, definitely. In a number of developing countries, you've now got an obesity problem, diabetes, heart problems, living alongside a hunger problem. So even within a country like Mexico or South Africa, you actually have a kind of dual world which we aren't used to because of a food system which is not actually delivering good nutrition to people at either end of the spectrum.
Yes, Carl, coming to you at that point, have you seen the thing broadly and widely, as Duncan was saying there, the problem in South Africa or other countries around the world? Have you had a chance in your travels to see the problems in action?
Oh, absolutely. You know, it's interesting you talk about obesity and hunger. In America, there's been an explosion of obesity, especially in children, which means diabetes, which brings other problems and other health issues right alongside of the hunger issue. And a lot of that is simply because of the focus is on how do we make the most money and not how do we feed the most people in a healthy way.
Thank you. Absolutely. So what are the urgent things that need to be done, Gordon?
Well,
urgent.
We need to make sure that the best practices are taken up around the world. We do need more research. We need more research on how to solve problems. But in particular, we need to work to connect small farmers to markets, both input markets, so they can get seed and fertilizer, and output markets so they can sell their crops. If they have the links to those